Now, it's our pleasure to introduce you to our three panels happening this afternoon and evening. Let's welcome our panel director, Titi, to start this afternoon with our Humanities panel.
Hi everyone, my name is Titi and I'm a freshman at Brown, and I'm also the panel director of the Humanities Panel. And as you all know, our panel is going to be around the topic of Asian American identity and racial justice. So we'll basically discuss some really important issues that are faced by Asian Americans today. So I will start off by introducing the speakers. So first we have the co-moderator of our panel, Professor Robert Lee, who is a and we have two in-person speakers joining us today. So first is Ms. Shuran Huang, and she is a photojournalist based in DC, and her work has been featured in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Wall Street Journal, and etc. So welcome, Shuran. And another of our speakers is Ms. Elaine Cho, and she is a Taiwanese American writer from California, and her debut novel Disorientation is just out last month and is currently available at our bookstore as well, so please go check it out. And we have three virtual speakers joining us today. The first is Professor Margaret Wu, who is an expert on the Anglo-American legal system, and she's a law professor at Northeastern University and an associate at the East Asian Legal Studies program at Harvard. Welcome, Professor Wu. And we have Professor Calvin Cheung-Miaw at Duke University, who just got his PhD at Stanford in 2021. And Calvin is a researcher on the intersection of Asian American intellectual history and social movements. Welcome, Professor Calvin. And we also have Marita Etcubañez, which is the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives at Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And Marita used to be a Director of Legal Services for the Asian American Legal Resource Center in DC. So welcome, Marita. So now the co-moderator will introduce the prompt, and let's get started.
Thank you so much, Titi. If you mind, I'll stay seated and we can all, is that okay? We'll all kind of speak from our seats. Thank you very much and I want to thank the organizers of this conference. It seems like it's a great conference and very exciting. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. We here at Brown, we are meeting on land seized from the indigenous Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples. We are in buildings, some of which were built by enslaved African Americans, and I should say with capital accumulated from the sale of opium to Chinese people. So our land acknowledgement is both local and global, I think. So some days I feel like we're in one of those grade school active shooter drills. Run, hide, fight. That's what they tell sixth graders in American schools. Which one is it going to be today? What is an Asian American today anyway? It seems like all the scripts being Asian Americans are now up for grabs. We're invisible and we're hyper-visible at the same time. Asian students who make up 20% of Harvard and other Ivy schools are hyper-visible in American culture. But the 70% of Asian American college students who attend public two-year community colleges and work are invisible. Right? Asian American success is celebrated in the press, while a high Asian poverty rate, the highest group of poor people in New York City, for example, is invisible. Asia and Asian Americans are everywhere now in popular culture, but at the same time, we are untrusted aliens in American culture. So which is it? And how do we negotiate those shoals? Asians might be monsters in the classroom or the lab or ice rink or half pipe, but on the streets and subway stations, we are just easy targets. We've asked each of our panelists today who have walked very different paths to take 5 or 6 minutes first to talk about their take on where Asian America is at this present moment, what directions we might take as individuals or as a community to forge a path forward that might give new meaning to the idea of Asian America. After the panelists each speak, we'll take 15 minutes or so to respond to each other's remarks, and then we'll still have plenty of time, I hope, to open the floor up to your questions and comments. So, with no further ado, I think I'd like to switch back between our guests who are here and our guests from afar. So why don't we start with Professor Wu. Oops, you need sound.
Hi, thank you. I forgot to unmute. Thank you so much. I wish I could join you all there physically. I managed to hurt my knee, and so at the last minute had to beg out and go virtual instead. But this is a terrific panel and terrific topic, and I guess I might just start off by sharing some good news and some bad news. And the bad news, I'll start off with the bad news, is that Asian American violence is up, and I think Rita will probably be able to even fill us in with more details. But anti-Asian hate crimes increased by 339% last year compared to the year before. And that's compared to an overall 11% increase in suspected hate crimes across America's cities. So Asian American hate crimes really top the list. And we know that this is underreported, right? Because it doesn't include all the microaggressions that we as Asian Americans face every day, the racial jokes, the slurs, the assumptions, and the downright hostile threats. And in fact, I myself has also recently faced this microaggression, and every single Asian American whom I've asked this question to, whether it's my family, my friends, my Asian colleagues, everyone has a story to share. So anti-Asian hate is pervasive and it's rising. And so, but the good news, I think, is, and I've only got 5 minutes, I could probably elaborate on this a little bit later, but we are seeing a rise of Asian American voices. So the last census data shows that Asian American increased their turnout voter rates by more than any other racial ethnic groups between 2016 and 2020 in the US presidential election. And this turnout jumped 10% points, right? While other minority groups increased by 6 points. For Hispanics and Black voters ticked up 3 points. And so, and what's really great, and I think it's because of all of you young voters perhaps, but that almost half of all AAPI voters who cast a ballot in 2020 did not vote in 2016. And a quarter had never voted in an election before. So we are seeing rising Asian American political activism. So New York City, we see more Asians in the city council. Boston, I live in the city of Boston, just elected its first Asian American woman mayor, Michelle Wu. And so we're really pleased. And so why is this such great surge in Asian American voters? Well, you do have more awareness of this rise in anti-Asian violence, should have more awareness of governments and people's lives. And social media has been really helpful, but I think that all of us as Asians now realize that policy matters and policy making matters. And so again, we have good news, we have bad news, but overall though, I think we should take heart. I think that we need to be cognizant both of the ethnic differences within our community. We also have to be cognizant of intergenerational differences. We also have to be cognizant of really the kind of the link between the homeland, what's happening there always seems to reflect what happens here. But even beyond all these nuances, I'm hoping that the uptake is actually an optimistic trend. So I'm just going to end this, and I'll be happy to go into more details. But yes, solidarity benefits us all.
Thank you. So maybe we'll turn now to Shuran.
Sure. This is a really broad question to answer who we are. In fact, I don't consider myself as Asian American because I'm not a citizen. Sadly, I'm still on visa. So I moved to the States in 2014, pursuing my degree in journalism and later on photojournalism. So I would say to just as a response to Professor Wu's remark, Asian Americans now, I would say, because I'm a photojournalist, I work on so many stories about Asian Americans and Asian American experiences. We are extremely vulnerable, and like you said, we are very unseen and seen at the same time. Like everybody knows, 4 days ago, there was a massive shooting in New York City subway that actually affect mostly Asian, Latino community because of Sunset Park. I think that it would be so arrogant for me to answer this question who Asian Americans are, but I would say as an Asian woman and as a freelance photojournalist based in Washington, D.C., I take a responsibility every day in my job to elevate Asian American experiences and Asian experiences. So because Professor Wu just mentioned about, voting, I have actually done a story in Pennsylvania, and historically swing state, and with a larger population of Asian community. I have traveled from the east of Pennsylvania, because of Pennsylvania is a state, to the west. So I've interviewed, I think, 15 Asian American voters, and I delve into the history and the complexity of who they are and why they want to vote and they don't vote. So I found out a lot in that photo project that the lack of resources for Asian Americans, especially in terms of language translation, and also just like the lack of the guidance for Asian Americans to vote is extremely concerning, and that's why I think Professor Wu said like 50% of the Asian Americans don't want to vote because they don't have the resources. Like think about if you're looking at like different Asian communities throughout the country, that a lot of them don't speak English. So I feel like one of the important visual elements that I put into that project was to provide a safe space for them to express themselves, because I can speak Mandarin, I can speak Cantonese, and a lot of them, actually 70% of the community speak those languages primarily. So I feel like to answer this question, it's important for all of us, no matter what we do in our career. As a photographer, I tend to always look for stories that can provide a safe space for, you know, Asian immigrants, especially to express themselves in different ways. And now that I'm actually working on a story with National Geographic about the history and meaning of our Asian names. So I myself is gonna tell my own story as a Chinese immigrant, but you know, I'm also collaborating with amazing writers like, you know, like Elaine. And actually for this story I'm collaborating with Minji Lee, and also photographers of Asian, you know, just like diverse Asian descent, to in different ways to elevate Asian identity. So I would say we as Asians and Asian Americans, because I feel like some of the audience here are probably not Asian Americans, we together need to build this solidarity. Like Professor Wu said, we also need to learn how to work with communities like Black or Latino communities, like, you know, communities of different ethnicities, to find how we can better solve social issues together, I guess. And then to build this, I guess, universal family union together. Yeah, so this is my remark.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe we'll turn to Marita. Can we?
All right, thank you so much for including me in this panel. I've been looking forward to this discussion. Apologies in advance if I go rather fast. I have a lot that I'm hoping to get through in the few minutes that I've been allocated. So I work with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We are a nonprofit organization focused on federal policy advocacy on civil rights issues that impact the Asian American community. So historically, we have worked on immigration, immigrant rights, voting rights, and addressing the discrimination that Asian American communities have faced over time that has really deepened during the COVID-19 pandemic. I know everyone is well aware of the increased anti-Asian hate and harassment that we have been facing. And, you know, when we first started hearing accounts of the coronavirus in China, we feared that Asian American communities in the US would face backlash, right? That is because, as many have already said, despite our long history in the United States, Asian Americans are still largely invisible. And when we are seen, we're often viewed as perpetual foreigners, right? We are tolerated when we're seen as serving a need. Perhaps we might be valued for what we're able to contribute, but we're never fully welcome. Whether we are tolerated, much less accepted, remains conditional. And this has been borne out through the pandemic as our communities have faced blame and hostility for a public health issue that originated in China. So at the end of 2021, Stop AAPI Hate, a community reporting site that was established in March of 2020, has received more than 10,000 individual reports of anti-Asian hate, including both hate incidents and hate crimes. And I'm happy to unpack that more later if that's something folks are interested in discussing. But to put into perspective what our communities have been grappling with over the last 2 years, you know, some of the first to feel the impact in the US were Asian American-owned businesses, right? As people avoided them, stopped patronizing them because of stereotypes that they held about our communities about COVID-19. In the spring of 2020, there was a family in Texas where the father and 2 young children were stabbed by someone who blamed them for spreading COVID-19. Then in early 2021, we started hearing numerous accounts of violent physical assault on our elders in cities across the country. And then, of course, everyone's aware of the mass shootings that our communities faced at the 3 Asian spas in Atlanta in March 2021, where 8 people were murdered, including 6 Asian women. And just yesterday, we marked the 1-year anniversary of the mass shootings at the FedEx facility in Indianapolis. And that happens to be a work site where many Sikh Americans work. And of the 8 people killed, 4 were Sikh. And then, while media attention seems to have moved on, unfortunately, our community is very much still under attack. So the impact of all of this is that our community is still living in fear, whether we acknowledge this or not, whether we have personally faced harassment or hate ourselves, and I expect that many have. This environment is having negative effects on all of us, on our mental health and well-being as individuals and as a community. So it's really important that we are aware and working to address all of this, right? So I'm going to talk about what our organization is doing, but I feel like a lot of our efforts are things that other people also, I know other people, including your student communities, are likely involved in. So we are continually working on public education and trying to build awareness, encourage people to report, and working to improve response capacity. I neglected to mention at the top, I'm in Washington, D.C. Our focus is on federal policy advocacy, so we are continually pressing for greater government engagement with and support of impacted communities. So with respect to the Asian American community that we know is tremendously diverse and has many different needs, this includes pushing agencies to proactively engage in outreach and education so that our communities know about the services and resources that are available to them. Pushing to improve language access and cultural competence so that when people seek to access those services, they actually can. And also greater investment. So increased resources for social services, as well as direct funding of community-based organizations that are often the ones providing these much needed services to our communities. So I know time is short, so I will just briefly mention two more things. We are also working in close partnership with an organization called Hollaback that has now renamed itself as Right to Be. And through this partnership, we've been offering bystander intervention training. So if that is something that you have not yet taken advantage of, I encourage you to do so. Yeah. And then, looking at the long term, we really think education is one of the long-term solutions to this increased hate, harassment, and discrimination. We support the inclusion of Asian American history in public education and higher education because we really feel like this is one of the answers to addressing stereotypes, misunderstanding, mis and disinformation. And while it might not have an immediate impact, we do think this is one of the long-term solutions. And this also links to some of our other work. We really need to be able to talk about race and racism. It's really vital to so much of what we do. And this implicates, this also implicates our work on affirmative action, as well as trying to address a lot of the current controversies around what people are labeling as critical race theory. So I will stop there, but I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Turn to Elaine.
Thank you so much, Bob. I have a lot of feelings, guys. I want to say I think this huge, broad question that I feel very humbled to be asking, what does it mean to be Asian American right now? I think we're at a crossroads. I think Asian Americans were used as a prop for white supremacy under the myth of the model minority for decades and decades and decades. And I think the violence against us was always present, right? It's historical. It's built into this country's bones. I mean, it's always been there, and it seems elevated to the surface now. But I think for a lot of Asian Americans, this coming to the surface, seeing all this violence and hatred against us really provoked this question of, can white supremacy save us? No, I think we are at a crossroads where we have to decide, not to try and make things so binary, but, which side are we on? Are we going to abolish the systems of oppression, that built this country, that do not function for us, that we've been taught, honestly tricked into believing are in our benefit? Because, right, we were fed this lie of like, you keep your head down, you go, get your higher education, pay your taxes, and just buy into this myth that that's freedom. But it's like, no, it was, we were taught that was freedom because we didn't disrupt anything and we were just good and obedient and quiet, right? And I think that all this violence is telling us, like, actually, they don't give a shit about you. They never gave a shit about us, right? And I think it's really hard to swallow, but we have to ask ourselves, will we continue to be used as a pawn? And I think a lot of Asian Americans, we're struggling right now, right? Because it's like, in the past election, we had several new Asian American like senators and Congress people that were conservative, Republican. And then I think, you have like a lot of Asian Americans who have become radicalized and are protesting against, against abolishing affirmative action. But then you had a huge wave of Asian Americans wanting to abolish affirmative action. So there is, I feel, this chasm, in our community, and there's such a great need, I think, to speak to each other and save ourselves, because I think we cannot rely on white supremacy to save us. And I think what I worry is that we think freedom or the solution is these systems that, historically weren't invented by us, were never for us. And I worry, if, quote unquote, this wave of violence passes, we fall into that complacency again, right? It's like, okay, right, settle down. You guys were, riled up for a few years, but, let's say COVID passes and it becomes a thing of the past. I just don't want us, to get trapped in that cycle again. And as Audre Lorde says, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, I think. It's really hard, right? How do we envision a future that is built for us, that is, what's the language, right? How do we invent a language to talk about freedom that is outside the bounds of white supremacy? How do we liberate ourselves from systems that are so hard to think outside of because that's all we've been taught, right? And like you were saying, how do we find solidarity with other people of color when precisely this government, this white supremacist system really does not want us to do that at all costs. Yeah. And I think something I learned that I was really angry that I had never learned about before was the Third World Liberation Front in the 60s. This part of history is so important when Black, Latinx, Asian communities banded together in Berkeley and Oakland, in the Bay Area in the 60s. And this was smashed. I mean, it terrified people and universities because they feared our collective power, right? And so I hope that at this crossroads right now, where do we choose safety? Do we choose, is it safer for me, right? The model minority, it's safer for me. I can succeed. I can have my 401k. My kids will have a good life. Or do we commit to what is harder, but will result in justice for all of us? I think that's sort of questions we got to ask ourselves that are really hard.
Great, thank you. Calvin.
Thanks. Thank you to the Brown China Institute for putting this together, and thank you to my co-panelists. It's been so wonderful hearing you all talk. So I'm a historian, so I'll try to provide a sense of the historical context. I hope people will disagree with me or ask me tough questions. I find that interesting. So anyways, my starting point for understanding Asian American communities today is recognizing that we live in the convergence of three crises. So first, the crisis of multiracial democracy. Second, the crisis of social inequality, or what I will call the crisis of neoliberal and carceral capitalism. And third, the crisis of US hegemony. I'll go through this kind of one at a time, right? So first, the crisis of multiracial democracy. To put it very bluntly, the central question confronting the United States today is whether we will have a multiracial democracy in which people of color are full members of the US polity, or whether we'll have a white nationalist authoritarian state. I don't think there's any middle ground. And we've lived through 4 years of a presidency that made a thinly veiled white nationalism into mainstream politics. And even with the electoral defeat of that president in 2020, those politics remain a major force in the US today, with an energized social base that is increasingly using threats of violence against elected officials in order to enforce discipline even within its own party. And the growing strength of this politics has also fueled the belief that the immigration regime that we've had since the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, that act which dismantled anti-Asian racism within immigration, right, this politics has fueled the belief that immigration reform has been catastrophic for the United States in terms of changing the racial and cultural composition of the country and the electorate. And because the social base of this politics is overwhelmingly, though not exclusively, white, which is a smaller and smaller portion of the electorate, voter suppression and anti-democratic measures aimed particularly at black voters is at the heart of right-wing political strategy. One of our political parties is quite openly the party of anti-democracy. 2, crisis of social inequality, or what I'll call the crisis of neoliberal and carceral capitalism. So over the last 45 years, the United States has become staggeringly unequal in economic terms, and public resources have shifted increasingly from forms of welfare support and social safety nets to punitive and carceral, so like prisons and policing, state functions. Now, why does this matter for Asian Americans? First, I'll give kind of 3 reasons. First, because most Asian Americans on a day-to-day basis have the same anxieties and concerns as other people in the United States, and that's having access to healthcare, having access to affordable housing, having access to robust social services and public goods like a decent education. Second, I think you can draw a line from this transformation in U.S. society directly to the increase in deportations of Southeast Asian Americans over the last 25 years. Third, I believe this matters for thinking about how we address the kind of COVID wave-related wave of anti-Asian violence. So on April 6, 2021, the New York Times published an article looking at individuals in New York City charged with anti-Asian physical assaults, and found that most of these were people that had a, quote, history of mental health episodes, multiple arrests, and homelessness. Now let me clarify a couple things. First, it is not true that mental illness makes somebody more likely to commit a violent crime. Second, I'm not proposing kind of a general theory of anti-Asian violence. I don't think this analysis necessarily holds for like the anti-Sikh violence that we saw in Richmond Hill on the same day of the subway shooting, for instance. But I am suggesting that we can think of anti-Asian physical assaults, and very specifically physical violence, not kind of the broader spectrum of anti-Asian hatred, as a product of the intersection of racial animus fueled by white nationalism on the one hand, and the clear failure of trying to deal with social issues such as mental health and homelessness through incarceration on the other hand. Or as one of my friends put it, we used to have robust affordable housing. Now we have another kind of affordable housing. It's called prisons. 3, crisis of U.S. hegemony. So the fantasy of a unipolar global order in the post-Cold War period, coordinated and shaped and led by the United States, has given way to the reality of that our world is becoming increasingly multipolar, as China in particular has grown in both geopolitical weight and economic muscle. And as I've written elsewhere, I think that much of what happens to the world in the future will be shaped by whether the U.S. ruling class is able to come to terms with the fact of decline, or if we will enter into a new Cold War period conceptualized as a struggle between wholly antagonistic ways of organizing society, a struggle that we must either win or bring the world down with us. We are, of course, already witnessing what such a struggle would mean in terms of the China Initiative, which has swept up Chinese American researchers and scientists in a frenzy of overzealous federal prosecution. But I think these things are actually just beginning. Okay, so that was a sketch of what I think the conjuncture that we're existing in. And so what does this mean for Asian American identity and politics? Elaine mentioned the Third World Liberation Front, and let me just reiterate that Asian American identity emerged in the late 1960s, not merely as a demand for recognition of cultural or ethnic distinctiveness, but as a marker of commitment to racial justice and multiracial solidarity, anti-imperialism, and anti-capitalism. And we live in a different time, in a different historical period, so I think there is a question of how do we either renew or adapt or reimagine those commitments. And I just hope that these brief remarks gesture to the need for Asian Americans to first be part of broad multiracial coalitions to push for racial justice and defend democracy against white nationalist authoritarianism. 2, to push for a social vision that challenges a carceral neoliberal capitalism that has proven to be a fertile ground for anti-Asian violence. And 3, to think about race in global and geopolitical rather than just domestic terms. These are not the only building blocks for Asian American liberation. You obviously need to think about gender and sexuality and many other dimensions. These are not the only building blocks for Asian American liberation, but they are crucial ones. So let's get free. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you all of you for these really insightful and thought-provoking comments. I'm sure you'll all have interesting comments and questions. Let me just begin. We're first going to maybe respond to each other's comments, but let me just prime the pump a little bit. One with a pitch. I have my own project is a digital mapping project of mapping anti-Asian violence, both in the United States, both vigilante violence, such as we see on the streets, and historically since the 19th century till today, but also violence that the state has done in terms of surveillance and incarceration and deportation, and also the global violence of American imperialism in Asia. So that's a set of maps that'll go online at some point, we hope in May. So I think as a way of kind of providing some context and way to visualize what all of our speakers have been talking about. But let me just kind of maybe throw a question out to the group. A few days ago, it was announced that Zhu Yi, a California Asian American skater who's moved to Beijing, had been admitted to Beijing University, right? Her father taught at UCLA, now she's at Beida. And it struck me as really a moment. This is, the idea, we have always thought of Asian immigration to the United States. We have rarely ever thought about Asian migration to Asia, right? And particularly, I think, to China. My great-grandparents came here in search of gold, right? Maybe Zhu Yi is going to China in search of gold. And it struck me as really a moment to think about this notion of what it means to be Asian American. She's born in Southern California, grew up there, seems now happy to try to make her way in China. So the question of kind of what it means in this moment to develop, to forge an identity in this particular moment in the United States, in China, in that space between perhaps, is a particularly interesting thing at this particular moment. So I'm just going to throw that out, and people can make of it as what they want.
I could take a stab if
Sure.
you guys want. So I think this is such an interesting question because if you were taking an Asian American history course 25 years ago and your main textbook was Strangers from a Different Shore by Ronald Takaki, you would learn that basically Asian American history is people come here, they're treated like foreigners, and kind of the main thrust, the main dynamic of Asian American activism or social activism is to overcome that perception and to become part of the United States and to be American fully. And I think it's unquestionable that I guess there's well, first, it's not clear that that ever fully reflected the ideas and aspirations of the folks from Asia that come to the U.S., but it's certainly clear that there's all kinds of different ways of being somebody of Asian descent in the United States that doesn't necessarily include identifying with America in the ways that our received histories have suggested that we ought to. I guess for me, the question is, folks that can do that tend to have resources that allow them some kind of control over their destinies. I mean, most Asian folks in the U.S. don't have that, and I guess I'm just a believer in you need political power. Like, I firmly believe Asian folks in the U.S. need political power in the U.S. to control our lives and the destinies of our communities. I don't know if we have to justify that as like trying to prove that we're American. I guess that's one of the questions that your comment opens up for me is there ways for us to advance a vision of the United States that departs from waving the flag and saying that we're American and we identify with America and we've contributed to America and that's why we ought to be included in the governance of this country? I mean, that's one question that it opens up for me. But I guess for me, like, I believe we should have political power in the United States. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, Margaret.
Yeah, so I mean, this is also really interesting, and as much as we are creating a space here in America, hasn't our history has always been finding home, and in the sense that even historically, you know, Asians in the 1800s, 1900s, it's always been a back and forth between the borders of the Pacific. And so, you know, what I find this to be really interesting is that our need, the Asian Americans' need to find home is strong, and that even as we're and here it is, you have this tennis. I've forgotten her sport, but you know, where she is born and raised in the U.S., but nevertheless still has this need where not completely at home here to try to go back and find a piece of home back there. And so I just see this as being a trajectory of the past Asian American identity history. I mean, it's finding home.
I agree. So to respond again, as a response to Professor Wu's response, that I think a big part of my job as a photojournalist in DC is to help people who are Asian immigrants or Asian Americans or Asian internationals, so like me, to find a home. But for me, it's to find a home in media environments. Because, you know, like, that's like, it's really concerning to me that I'm the only active Asian woman photographer based in DC, especially when I'm covering politics, immigration, human interest stories, and I'm always the only one. And, you know, in terms of, let's say, if we follow Biden to, President Biden to cover some kind of things that he's doing, I'm always the only one. And we are so token. But I feel like in my job as a photographer, I always try my best to elevate Asian American identity through the stories that I do. Because if I don't, nobody else would. So, for example, because Professor Wu just mentioned that, you know, like, we all are struggling with identity as Asian internationals or Asian Americans. Like, for example, I was born in mainland China. I'm a Hakka, 客家人. And my parents brought me around the world. Growing up, it was such a privilege. At the same time, I think rarely that people will actually understand that because this is the life experience I have, I'm always struggling with my identity. So with the photojournalism work that I do, especially stories about Asian experiences, it's a project for me to not only, it's sort of work for me to not only find myself in the work that I do as an Asian Americans, as an Asian international, but also as a platform to Asian Americans or Asian internationals to express themselves, like I mentioned before, to truly just to look for who they are as Asians in my work, so that we all will be more seen, at least in media, which is a really great tool to affect politics and affect policies in so many different ways. Yeah, so that's my answer to the question.
Well, I think this question of representation, and certainly representation at the political level, right, of electoral politics, is really important and critical. But I'm also really interested in this question about how we're represented, and now how we can represent ourselves in the humanities, in literature and media and so forth. And is the space for, let's say, Asian American literary production, is that a growing space? What kinds of possibilities are there out there for that? One of the things that, if you watch as much television as I do, and you go to Netflix and it's like, you think, half of, and maybe it's just my feed on Netflix, but half of what I'm seeing are, Korean soap operas or, Hindi detective shows, and, you see just a huge amount now of kind of Asian content in the America media space. And I'm just, and I'm wondering if that enables us to tell Asian American stories.
I have thoughts about this. I think, let's talk about Fresh Off the Boat and Crazy Rich Asians, right? Those two shows were lauded as, this is the representation we needed, right? Fresh Off the Boat, it'd been 20 years since there was any kind of Asian American sitcom, right? There was like This American Girl in like the 90s that barely ran. And then with Crazy Rich Asians, right, it'd been a long time since there was such a big Asian cast. And it was also lauded as this momentous time for Asian Americans, right? And I think it's sort of like damned if you do, damned if you don't, because on the one hand, it was like, we're seeing Asian faces on screen, we're given that visibility that we've been craving, right? But then people were like, with Fresh Off the Boat, we were seeing these really tired cliches and stereotypes, and the honest, like it just felt so safe. It just felt like pandering to white audiences. The way it was presented on ABC was like, we're gonna make being Asian palatable to you. We are not gonna offend you. Like sort of their digs at whiteness were just like very, very gentle, right? Like sort of like how Blackish did that. And I think that, that put us in this awkward position of, do we celebrate this show and kind of stand behind it to say, these are telling our stories, or do we want to distance ourselves from it and say, like, no, you're reducing us to these sort of these old cliches. And with Crazy Rich Asians, it's like there was all these issues with class and how like Singaporean how race was represented, and you had like no brown people except there were like these two guards, and Awkwafina's black. Oh my, I mean truly just like wanted to die of embarrassment, right? So it's like we take 2 steps forward. Sometimes it's like, wait, did we take 2 steps back at the same time? Why is this constantly happening? And yet at the same time, I'm like, why is there so much pressure on us to not fuck it up? But white people make bad art every single day, and the next day Hollywood is like, here's another, $1 million, go make another bad movie. another bad TV show, right? So it's at the same time, it's like I want representation because representation is about life or death because it is cultural discourse and it functions as propaganda half the time. So it affects our daily lives, right? It's like on the one hand, it feels so important to quote get it right. And on the other hand, I'm like, why are the standards for us so high? And when can we be free enough to make as much bad art as white people make? I don't know when will we get there?
Yeah, so that's the goal, to be able to make bad art without repercussion.
Yeah, right? That seems
That's
to me
great.
like what freedom is, that we have our own really bad Lifetime,
Yeah.
movies. But then we have, art that is elevating and probing like, these really hard questions and showing our humanity in all our depth and complexity. It's like we want both. And I just don't want people, and I think especially white Americans, they just want to kind of give themselves, a pat on the back to be like, I loved Fresh Off the Boat. Crazy Rich Asians, I thought Henry Golding is so hot. I'm like a good white liberal. And just sort of end it. We're done. Guys, we solved the representation. We're done. And it's like, no. Walk it back, So we constantly have to question these choices, and yet I feel like we're just so stressed out by this. It's like, I want us to be carefree. Like, freedom is, that we get to be carefree.
One of the questions that I'm kind of thinking about is this question in some ways of what some people would call the new Cold War. Certainly the contradictions between the United States and China and what Calvin described as kind of the decline of American hegemony, and thinking about that as a context for all of these questions, whether or not it's policy making in Washington D.C. To kind of questions about voting rights and the election of Michelle Wu in Boston. But it always seems, and I read the Boston Globe, so it always seems that there is, and particularly if you read the letters to in the Boston Globe, it always seems somehow that despite the kind of policy achievements or electoral achievements, there is always this question about kind of this other picture of kind of the crisis of US-China relations or and the US empire generally. And so I'm wondering if people want to kind of help me think through that a bit.
I have a lot to say, but I will let someone else go first if they would like.
Why don't I begin and then you can take it deeper? How's that? Our work has involved addressing, in particular, a lot of the federal government's focus on Chinese Americans, right? The profiling of scholars, researchers, scientists, and we have had some successes in pushing back against that, including, the Biden administration's recent announcement that they would be ending the China initiative. But of course, we recognize that a lot of that is because they recognize that they cannot openly on their face continue to profile and discriminate against Chinese Americans. Our concern is that a lot of these practices will continue, even though it is no longer named the China Initiative, right? So we need to continue to safeguard against that. That is one response to your question, and I think we can go a lot deeper. Picking up on some of the other threads, I did want to take a moment to say that while this is a simple statement, there's no one right way to be Asian American, right? We all do this in different ways. We all have different identities. I will say that for purposes of building political power here in the United States, because of the structures we already have, many of our advocacy points as an organization continue to be, if you are a legal permanent resident in the US, we really urge you to consider naturalizing because only US citizens are able to vote, right? And then once you naturalize, let's make sure you are registered to vote and that you actually have the support you need to be an engaged voter. So, quick PSA for Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. There are provisions under federal law that certain jurisdictions where the population reaches a certain level, they must provide in-language assistance to voters that need support in other languages. And I'm happy to drop more information in the chat. There are more and more jurisdictions that are being required to provide coverage under Section 203. There's also Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act that a lot of people don't know about, which is that if you need assistance in the polls, you have the right to bring someone in to help you. So it's not just in the areas where people have legally mandated support for language assistance, but there are all kinds of different ways that we should be actively supporting and helping voters that need help to participate in the democratic process. So those are my 2 cents. Happy to throw it to the next.
Yeah, I 150% endorse this message about registering to vote. Let me, I guess, so I think back to the first Cold War, like, I guess, the Cold War. We don't officially have a second one yet, but I think back to the Cold War, which was an extremely complicated period for folks interested in racial justice. Because the U.S. was fighting for hegemony in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America, many folks of color in the U.S. were able to use Cold War dynamics to win some measure of racial reform and win some kind of progress. In Asian America, particularly, you could think about the election of the first Asian American congressman, Dilip Singh Sond in California, who won first his congressional primary and then his general election on the idea that he would go to India and say that because of his election, the U.S. as a democracy cared about racial equality, and the United States was the way to go and not the way of the Soviet Union. He was elected in the 50s, actually at when Jim Crow was still in existence in the United States. But that's an example of some kinds of advancements that folks were able to use. Folks were able to win because of the dynamics of the Cold War. Now, what was the price of that? The price of that was you had to align yourself with U.S. imperialism. You had to remain silent about what the United States was doing to the countries of Asia and Latin America and Africa at that time, because your term of the condition of you being included in the U.S. polity was agreeing that the U.S. should have moral and political leadership in the global realm. So it was a contest over what racial justice would mean. Does racial justice mean inclusion into the U.S. domestically? Is race a domestic matter? Is it mainly about kind of representation in the halls of Congress and in the suites of power? Or is race a global phenomenon? These were what the critics of the Cold War said, was that race is inseparable from the dynamics of neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism globally. And I think that's probably what we're going to see again. I mean, there will be plenty of folks who will say, yes, this is a contest between democracy and autocracy. We're on the side of democracy, and the way to prove it that we can do this struggle against China without being racist is by elevating Asian Americans into positions of power. And there will be folks that'll say, we are opposed to this Cold War because we're opposed to U.S. hegemony. That's at least how I think it's going to shake out in the U.S. And it's going to be a complicated period.
I don't have anything well formulated here as I'm sitting here kind of reacting and reflecting on what's been said. And it's been really, really interesting. So I'm, it's always been that what happens over there we're tied to what happens over there as to how we're being treated over here, right, in the US. And we could argue, or we could point to very kind of Machiavellian political strategizing of American, American political dynamics. That is, that we could elevate Asian Americans as we're fighting and impose hegemony abroad. I might even, on top of that, take just a very cultural position by saying, the West is very dialectical. It's always black and white. It's always, East versus West. It's always, and it's a inability to see that we as Asian Americans can encompass a multitude of facets, right? So yes, what's happened over there affects what happens to us over here, but it doesn't mean that we're any less American. But somehow, and this is a wildly kind of a cultural comment, but it really does seem to me that there's an inability to see that we are both, at least for me, women, in academia, Asian, Chinese, American. I mean, there are just all the intersectionalities that Kim Crenshaw has pointed to, and there's a reluctance to embrace that kind of intersectionality. So yes, there is definitely, we should consider the political dimension, the kind of geopolitical, international relations aspect to this, but I just wanted to point out kind of the cultural dimension as well.
Well, I think these have been really great. This is a really great conversation, but I want to open it up to people here, the audience, and I think maybe there may be folks who've sent in questions online. But please, we have a question.
Yeah. Wait, should I is there a microphone or should I just
I think if you speak up.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for a very important talk. My name is Ji-Hoon. I am a senior here at Brown University studying anthropology. I'm kind of hesitant to ask this because I feel like it's kind of feeding into that black and white discourse that Professor Wu just talked about. But I guess I found Professor Miaw, correct me if I pronounce your name wrong, your point about the geopolitics and then also the white nationalism in the US and then kind of the positionality of Asian Americans in between. I found that very interesting. So I feel like within academia there's a lot of understanding of geopolitics, pushing Asian Americans away from their heritage in Asia, and also white nationalism, pushing them out of the American sphere. But within the public, it's always a black and white. So how, and then obviously public discourse affects the policymakers in both the U.S. and also in Asia. So I guess my question is facing this black and white, and then facing both Asian societies and American society, pushing out Asians in the U.S. or Asians outside of Asia. How do we is it a way I don't know, I feel like it's harder to promote solidarity. So yeah, it's hard to phrase a question, but is should the identity be distancing Asian Americans or Asians outside of Asia from Asia, or is it should it be more is it more about should it be forming a distinct identity separate from Asia, or should it still be forming connections regardless of both Asia and America, pushing us kind of, yeah. So yeah, sorry about rambling.
Can I take a shot at a little bit of that?
course.
Kind of think about. So I think in the example I gave of the skater Zhuyi, just as one individual, because in some ways we make those decisions around identity are always in some ways individual, because we're always negotiating. One day I'm dad, right? The next day I'm like university professor. The next day I'm something else, right? So we're always negotiating identities, and I think this identity between Asian and Asian American, we used to have a kind of bright line, If you weren't a citizen, you were Asian. If you were a citizen, you were Asian American, right? There's this kind of bright line. And that's, I think, increasingly certainly no longer as bright, right? And I think that's one thing that's happening is that people, and particularly I think people as Professor you pointed out, people who have the privilege of travel, and so forth, travel back and forth, move back and forth across those boundaries. Now, increasingly, that's going to be perhaps a more complicated and difficult thing to negotiate. But I think people are that way. I mean, people negotiate that in their daily lives, the choices they make, what to watch on television, for example, right? All of those things make that distinction between Asian and Asian American increasingly a fuzzy, soft boundary, right? So I think there is that. And then there's this other question, of course, is how do we then think about ourselves more broadly in relationship to other groups in the United States, right? What's our commitment to solidarity with African Americans or Latinos or women or gay, lesbian, trans people, right? What are our commitments towards social justice, which is yet another realm, I think, of thinking about how we negotiate our identities. But please.
Well, something you were saying about the line getting blurry or thinner made me think about all the hate crimes we've been experiencing. They don't give a shit what your nationality is. They're not like, hold on, how many years have you been? Do you have a green card? Do you have citizenship? They look at us and they just see, right, Asian, and we are all subjected to their hatred and their racism. So I think, I don't want to say there's any upside, right? There's no upside, but yeah, I hope that just a kind of reminder that we have to be in this together. And I think it is hard. Like, I'll give an example. I went to a protest in Flushing. This was right after George Floyd was murdered. And in New York, there were, waves of protests against the police, abolishing the police. And that was like a huge discussion, right? Abolish the police. And in Flushing, in which you guys may know is like a very large immigrant community, Asian immigrant community, there was a pro-NYPD protest. So what happened was a lot of Asian Americans, like the call went out that we needed to show up to counterbalance the image of, because the news were going to jump on it. And the news were going to say, look, Asians overall are pro-police. See, look at them protesting. And when we showed up, there were, it was so surreal because these were my parents. These were my uncles and aunties where they were waving I love NYPD signs. And then there were us, the second, third generation, whatever you want to call us, waving our fuck the police. We were literally on opposite sides. And I remember they were largely older, and a lot of them, they were struggling with how they felt in English, and so people who were perfectly bilingual were standing in the middle, translating, and they would tell us, we just started chanting in Mandarin and Cantonese, and we would just say woman, I need woman. We were just trying to be like, we love you. And then they would be like, your parents should be ashamed to know you're out. It was so surreal. And the NYPD got in the middle. And we went to protect, I know it sounds insane, because some of the aunties and uncles were like trying to get at us. And the NYPD were holding them back. And I was like, this is the weirdest moment I've ever been in. But it just spoke to like this divide that is so important not to shut people out, right? I was seeing like, Asian people, my father's age, my mother's age, in like a red Trump hat. And I was shouting, well, I need. Because we didn't, what else can we say, right? Like it was just having to call in and just hoping we could have a dialogue. And what happened was, some of these people who were totally bilingual, like, I mean, they stayed for hours and they actually had these really meaningful conversations. And what the feeling was these immigrants were scared. It's not that they're like pro, carceral system. They don't even necessarily know like that word, you know what I mean? They're just like, I'm scared. I've been taught my whole life that the police are here to protect me. They don't know, like if you say like that's anti-Black, they're just like, what are you talking about? I don't understand, and then I feel like it's coming from this place of condescension. Oh, how do you not know that? How do you not know that's anti-Black? And then they feel shut out. And then what happens? The next term they vote the new Trump, right? And we can't shut them out. And we have to have these dialogues. So I don't know what the answer is, but I know at that moment it was just a stark, like literal representation of like, we were trying to talk to each other and there was like anger and frustration, but there was love and we knew it was like, this is our family. Like, we didn't want them to pull away. We wanted the NYPD to go away. We were like, let us speak to each other. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your answers, and I just want to add that like COVID also, and all these like events, including like hate crimes, made me realize like the kind of the privilege in terms of mobility and like security, as like international students at Brown have been having. So yeah, I totally feel you in like how we're realizing some of the things that we have just had over generations.
I have a question. I'm not a Brown University student, but like I come here, know the summit, so I was drawing. So my question is, when we talk Asian American, they are always American. But when we're talking about Asian, it's more diverse. So how we are going to unite together to solve the issue we are facing together? Because like when we also talk about geopolitical thing, that major background is about China and America and the U.S. conflict. However, there are many other Asian countries, and there are other Asian Americans here. They are studying here, they are working here, they are facing the same hate crime and discrimination. So when you stand at a point from America, you need to hold the American value, or let's put aside if it's right or wrong. As American, you hold American value, you stand for America. And for some Asian, especially from China, they also hold their nationality values. So but they are facing the same hate crime happening in the US. So when we try to like work together with each other on this thing, but we also cannot work together that smoothly because we also have a conflict perspective there. So in this situation, probably everyone, like most people don't know the answer, but like it's just a question I want to bring out to like let us think how we can address this. Yeah, it can be think from policy side, political side, all from the culture side, as Professor Wu just mentioned. It's just very complex. Yeah, I just want to bring up this question, so probably we can discuss about this.
Tough one.
I can answer. That's my friend, by the way, David. What a brilliant question. So, I get very frustrated often working in the media industry that I am, like I mentioned before, the only Asian photographer in a group of 99.5% of white men photographers. And of course, I get frustrated over different media outlets because I'm a freelancer. So I work with, like you mentioned, different big organizations in the States. And they either don't have photo editors that are from Asian backgrounds, or they don't have Asian photographers. So it's really frustrating to me that a lot of times media industry definitely has misrepresented Asians, Asian culture, Asian immigrant experiences, and Asian experiences in general. So I have to tell you, every day I try to advocate for having more Asian representation in this industry, but it just hasn't happened yet. It's like slowly happened. I feel like as an Asian woman, I have to work so hard to be seen in DC. And especially political scenes in DC, it's like such a white space. And a lot of times, for example, I just recently did photo stories about women voting rights activists. And I try my best, even if it's really time consuming, to find Asian photo collaborators that are from different regions of Asia. East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, or even just, from the West. And then I was like, I feel like a lot of times if I don't work in this industry, I just doubt that how many people out there or like photographers would make the efforts to increase this representation. So a lot of times I feel like even for myself, compared to someone who's Asian American photographers, we bring in different perspective and we bring in different insights, even we work on the same story. So I would say for media industry especially that if they continue not responding or like they don't sponsor Asian photographers like me on visa, and if they don't hire photographers who are actually were born in other Asian countries, it would be so hard to try to address the issue. But myself every day, because it's such a practical field, I just try my best to represent the entire community versus I'm not even Asian Americans, but I try to learn and represent everything. But yeah.
I have a thought on this, and it's a terrific question, and it really is a dilemma, I think, for all Asian Americans, and I agree with the prior speaker that when we take on positions, we're representing Asian American, but in the same way that we are Asian American, that doesn't mean that we're not racist. Just because we're Asian American doesn't mean that we know everything about Asian American. That when we take our positions, that we need to be cognizant of just this point, that there are so many variations and so many perspectives that can constitute Asian America. So it's great to represent, to be the one and only. And I think it is so hard. And I really admire people who are the one and only in their field. But then the next step would be to figure out how to be more inclusive. So, for example, I guess just for my own work, both on the faculty and the faculty hiring committee, I'm also on the board of Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. We do try very hard not to have only issues that deal with Chinese Americans. We try to figure out if there's Sikh, South Asian issues that we're not paying attention to. And in our hiring, we really do try to make sure that it's not just East Asia that gets represented, but also South Asia. So I think the speaker, the questioner, really raises a good point, and it just really ultimately rests on all of us to be cognizant of the variety of perspectives, and that we really do try to make sure that we bring in other voices as well. So.
Yeah. Again, I think that's a great question, and Asian Americans or Asians in America come from over 40 countries. Speak hundreds of different languages. They immigrate not just from places in Asia, but places in Latin America or Africa or Europe now. So this notion of, there's not one size, it's not, not a boot that you can put on, right? I always, and my classes was saying that Asian America, being Asian America is not who you are, but who you stand with, right? That there's a way that we need to think about this question of values. What are, can we create a set of what we might call Asian American values based on our experiences, our wide individual and group experiences, right? And that conversation that goes on there, to think about who it is in the world that we stand with, right? In some ways, to get back to Calvin's point, original point, right? And that kind of might help us define what we mean by Asian America, an Asian American identity. It's not just a pair of pants that you can put on, right? It's a process of dialogue, of talking, to fighting out, figuring out what it means, right, in this particular moment, right?
Yeah, because I think it's an ongoing process.
Absolutely.
It's not like when we talk about Asian American and other non-immigration Asian in the U.S. It's a flowing process. Some students come here and gradually become the Asian American. Sure. They trans their nationality. It's a flow, and some people just go back, but it doesn't matter. It represents a so diverse group, so that it's probably important to stand out of the box and create something that's really unique, but represent our entire Asian in the U.S.
And
that kind of value to add to the American society.
yeah. And I think we really need to think about those people in this large community, or would-be creating community, of people who we don't really see normally, right? 1 in every 7 Asians in the United States is undocumented, right? Asians in America represent the fastest growing undocumented segment of immigrants, right? And we never hear about undocumented Asian Americans in the media, right? I mean, that's just one of those invisible, hidden things. And we don't talk about it ourselves, we don't really think about it, and so forth. So there are communities out there, sizable communities of Asian Americans who, aren't in the conversation, so to speak. And I think that's one of our tasks, is to kind of, make those connections, try to figure out who's out there who we should be talking to.
Yeah. In media practice, we, for example, me as a photographer, I always try to find the untold stories or stories that are unseen, and pretty much to try to fill the gap that in our industry narrative. At the same time, just you mentioned about DACA, right, recipients, it's very important for journalists to speak at least a couple of languages. For example, for me, I try to work on my language skills every day, especially the story community I want to cover, especially Asian community. But I just don't see media outlets listing, multilingual skills as one of their requirements. So how we gonna elevate Asian community, especially part of the community who don't even speak English? And also I always have this question when I do story, why does English have to be the primary language? And sometimes when I try to push a multilingual story out, especially with big media outlets, they tend to just cut me off on the language translation. I even offer to translate. You know, the whole article into Chinese, they are like, "Oh, sorry, well, our developing team can't do this." I was like, how this little by little, I think, for example, for media outlets, they need to work so hard in different details to try to really embrace this union within, you know, like just visualizing or narrating different communities, not just Asia, but, you know, other communities too.
Yeah, you can give me have
Okay, I have a following up question with Kevin about the political representation of Asian. So you said we want more people to, like Asians, to involve into politics to get more power on that. I'm not going to deny that, but is it necessary will lead to the result we desired? So for example, we can have so many examples. For the Black community, we have Kamala Harris as vice president. We have the Black New York City mayor, and we have so many Black House and Senate representatives. But still, the United Society have discrimination on the Black community. This problem is not solved just because of the going to those core politics part. So my question is, if more Asians get involved into the politics, what's the next? What should we do?
I think Marita actually might be a better. I can speak to this, but you might be the best person to address this.
I mean, first I'll just elevate what I put in the chat. We claim Vice President Harris is one of our own too. Don't forget, she's also Asian American. You know, that's whether it matters if we can achieve and bring political power to bear. I feel like isn't the right question. Obviously, we need to be building towards this, right? To reach the point where we actually can influence policies and have our voices heard and have our community needs met. So it's just something we need to continue to do, even if we don't see immediate victories. I would say that the African American community has marked tremendous progress over time. Are we where we need to be now in 2022? I don't think anyone would say yes to that, right? There is a long arc for social justice, and we need to keep doing the work to keep pushing for the solutions we think we need and to get us where we think we need to be. So it's a very broad answer, but that's what I'll give you right now.
And then just to clarify my prior remarks, we have to do all three things. We have to defend democracy, and build political power. We need to transform the structure of neoliberal and carceral capitalism, and we need to seriously confront the question of geopolitics. Let me say. I think you can't just do one of those. The three are interlinked, and I think those are the three building blocks you need in order to begin thinking about Asian American liberation, alongside, as I mentioned, questions of gender and sexuality, and many other aspects as well.
Hi, my name is Raul. I'm a first-year student from Beijing, China, and my question is about like the idea of American dream, because unlike other countries where they like unite their nations with language, ethnicity, or culture or religion, the U.S. The centrifugal force of this nation is about the idea of American dream in terms of like opportunities and freedom of choice. So like the first generation Asian American immigrants, they hold this value with a great extent. They came to this country and they were learned withhold with their previous value to be obedient, to be good, as what Ms. Cho has said, the parents' value, and they tend to follow the value of the conservative side more. However, like along with the family education with the like younger generation of Asian American community, there's like a huge disconnect with the previous value and the reality with the introduction of like information and technology, where a lot of like information were conceived by the public. So this generation gap, where the previous generation are kind of like conservative side, and the new generation tend to be more politically active and to care more about issues within the community. How would you project and like how the new generation of Asian American community is going to challenge and evolve and reform the idea of the American dream and project this to the future generations?
I think the American dream is crumbling before our eyes as we like. Yeah, it's because how do you believe in something that that you're suffering under? And I think the American dream was sold so much on individualism, that idea of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you know, if you work hard, you can achieve anything. All of that is to distract us from systemic racism, institutionalized racism, because then nothing has to change. It's all on us. If you're poor, if you're you're sick, too bad. I guess you didn't work hard enough, right? So I think the American dream, a lot of people like are starting to see we've been sold a lie. This is a trap. And I have a lot of friends that, yeah, like are second generation or beyond who say, like, Mom and Dad, why did you leave Taiwan? Because, like, when I got sick there, I paid $20 to see the doctor. And in Brooklyn, I'm just like, I just go to the bodega and ask for, like, an ice pack. Like, that's all I can afford. You know, like, and yeah, and I think for a lot of our parents, they're just like, but America's the dream. Like, I suffered and came here for you. And we're like, I love Taiwan. Like, everything's so nice there. No one shouts, like, slurs at me. And also, yeah, socialism's great. Like, you know, so I think there is absolutely that divide. But yeah, I think for a lot of people, we see finally sort of this lie that we are fed, and we understand why. Because, right, if we buy into the myth, then the people in power get to retain power, and they would just love for things to continue on for a next 100 years exactly the way they are. But yeah, this American dream, it's a sham.
I think it might actually, kind of thinking about your the story that you had about New York and the two demonstrations. I think that's a kind of you know, there's a kind of double trap going on, right? So there's a trap that I think that, you know, that a lot of us feel that the American dream has failed at one level. But I think particularly for older people and parents, you know, immigrant parents, who are really sold on, you know, the notion of meritocracy and the notion of safety, right? See, both of those things, you know, eroded, particularly if you live in New York City or you live in San Francisco, right? So place matters. But, you know, with the debates about, you know, dismantling, you know, elite public high schools, and there's a whole debate about that, and we could talk about whether that's in fact relevant or not, but that's and Asians are scapegoated in that, right? This whole question of overrepresentation is a way in which I think Asians are really targeted at that. And I think as a parent, you know, you might, an immigrant parent and particularly one who's working class and for whom those schools are the lifeline, right, feel extremely frightened about that question, just as they do about security on the street. So I think we're seeing both of those things happening, right? A kind of disillusionment amongst, you know, second, third generation Asian Americans. It's not really working. We're still we're still thought of alien, we're still thought of as foreigners, even though we've been here for 100 years. And at the same time, immigrant parents who were saying, this door is closed. The door to success is now closed because merit no longer counts in the United States, right? So I think we're seeing both of those things happening, and that's shaping this conflict within Asian America too, I think, right?
So one more question and we'll summarize and conclude the panel.
Thank you. I'm Alicia. I'm a freshman here. So my question is, I think nowadays there seems to be like a trend that culture is becoming political and politics is becoming cultural, and like of course they separately have their like own languages and rhetorics and of course assumptions as well. And we always say like politics makes things complicated, but I think like that influences kind of both ways. And I guess my question is, does this merge of politics and culture, does it make storytelling easier or harder in a sense, kind of getting the genuine experience through now that we have to more or less see culture as like a political object and politics as a cultural object? Does that make storytelling difficult? And of course, there's like a story being heard and being understood are like different ideas as well.
Oh, if people looking at me, I was talking too much. So did someone else? Or yeah, I can talk later. But does someone have thoughts on that? I feel like photojournalism is definitely storytelling.
Indeed.
Building a story.
I don't know. It's interesting. So many people have asked me, how does that feel like to cover politics as even non-citizen? I just honestly just walk in without having any personal perspective. And of course, I'm leaning towards the liberal sides, but when I cover politics, I just see it as a job. But in terms of culture, I have to say it's so important to embed culture in visual storytelling, because that's like in response to what I said earlier, why it is so important to have Asian photo editors or Asian photographers, because we bring in such important cultural elements in stories that people from other communities would not understand. But after they see our photos, they may understand more. So I feel like to do visual stories, it's a way to make an impact in politics, I guess, but I do a lot of human interest stories. It's not even necessarily about politics anyways, so it's more about human experiences. I think I'm still in the phase of doing stories that try to make Asians more seen than trying to affect politics. Does that make sense? Yeah, I hope that makes sense to you. But yeah, you were a storyteller too, in text.
I actually, just to jump in, I actually think that storytelling is even more important than anything else, because it's the one thing that connects folks, because it conveys both politics and culture, and in a way that people can relate to, right? And so actually, I think both, the writer and the photojournalist, storytelling is, you guys are really needed.
Yeah, like for example, like one picture represents so many things. People understand or interpret one image in so many different ways. So I think, like I mentioned earlier, I feel like as a photojournalist, I take the responsibility to make Asians seen in every single photo that I make about Asian experiences.
Yeah, everything's political, right? Because I think this is why so many of us are getting upset when it would be like new surge in COVID cases, and then the photo that would be chosen to go along with it was always an Asian person or be set in Asia, and we were just like, please, we are being stabbed. Like, can you not, put this photo?
Yeah, that's why
It was so frustrating.
the lack of representation, like I mentioned before, in media outlets is so concerning now that if I sit there as a photo editor, I would not choose that photo for that story.
Because
But if they don't hire Asian photographers from Asian backgrounds, they will not know or understand
or
the
not
pain
care. Yeah.
or like
Yeah.
the lack of representation that we are feeling. So, and again, representation is so important, and it's political in a way too, to affect how a narrative is formed in different ways.
Yeah. I think Viet Thanh Nguyen, I really love Viet Thanh Nguyen, who said all discourse is political. To show that it's nothing is really innocent in this world that we're living in right now. So if you have 100 films where an Asian man is represented as a sexless, buck-toothed eunuch, that affects how they're treated in real life, right? 100 movies where an Asian woman is just a silent sex toy, that affects how we're treated in real life. So it's like, it can be an Austin Powers movie. Do you guys remember that horrible Austin Powers movie from like 2006 that had Fook Mi and Fook Yu, the two twins dressed as schoolgirls? Oh, don't even Google it. You'll be traumatized. But that's billed as a comedy, right? And you could ask yourself, why would an Austin Powers movie affect my lived experience, or how would that? Who cares or whatever? But I'm like, there's 100 of them, and that matters. Not even 100. I'm downplaying. There's thousands now if you want to count back to like the 20s when it first started. So everything we consume, I think, is weighed with history. I think what white people often like to say to excuse themselves and make themselves feel better is by saying, but that happened so long ago. Slavery happened, and it's so long. Why are you still talking about it, right? And what I want to say to them is, we're living history. History's in my body. I live it every day. Like, I carry the trauma of my, grandparents escaping war and surviving literal bombs. So I can't run away from history. Good for you if you can. How nice, right? But I carry that in me forever. And yeah, I just think it's an easy way out to say this isn't political, this isn't historical, right? To cut those ties. And I think we have to remind them, like, the implications are real. We are being stabbed. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we tend to avoid politics as the language, so then the story can be clean in a sense, but obviously kind of embracing politics as the language we express our identity and culture is also a very brave direction, I think, in a way, because we're well aware what kind of threat or what kind of threat and challenges we're facing in doing so, but nonetheless this is kind of where it's going.
Also, just don't forget, you're Asian women. We really struggle and face very different challenges versus Asian men in this nowadays. We are hypersexualized, we are so dehumanized. And a lot of times, even to do my job, I need to, especially when I cover stories about Asian women, I'm very careful about how I narrate them in stories, especially in photos, because every photo means so many different ways, and just a reflection.
Well, this has been a wonderful hour and a half now. And so I want to thank all of the panelists and our organizer, TT. But thank you so much. It's been a really provocative, and thought-provoking conversation. I'm just really delighted.
Yeah, so I think we talk a lot today. So we talk about intersectionality of the issues that we're facing, like the complexity of the concept of Asian American itself, and how we need to consider that everyone has different like experiences and coming from different perspectives. And we talk about political and economic empowerment of Asian Americans, how we should provide more resources for voters and educate people about Asian American history. We also talk about media representation of Asian Americans and how we could provide a safe space for people to tell their stories and hear each other's voices. And also we talk about how the issue of race could be viewed from a broader context. So like from the perspective of like international relations and neo-imperialism. And ultimately, I want to say, we need to realize that Asian Americans are humans just like everyone else. And it's really important to facilitate this dialogue between different groups, whether it's Asians or African Americans or white. And we need to really hear and understand each other. And I hope that this panel can inspire all of you to think about not only the issue of race, but also compassion, empathy, and solidarity, and what is equality or equity, essentially. And thank you all for the speakers coming today and our wonderful humanities team here, and Zoe and Wendy for organizing the summit. And see you all in the political economy panel like a few moments.